Everyone enjoys cheering when a hometown boy or girl makes good. Tonight's speaker started out just down the road in Princeton. In fact, we're very pleased this evening not only to welcome him, but there is a Princeton delegation here, including our speaker's parents, Dr. William and Mrs. Ruth Besser, and we're very happy to have them with us. Richard Besser's education and work has taken him from Princeton and New Jersey around the nation to college at Williams, medical school, and residency at Johns Hopkins, then to Atlanta, where he worked at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, studying the epidemiology of foodborne diseases. Later, he served on the faculty of the University of California in San Diego. He returned to CDC in 1998, working in various capacities, including directing the CDC's Coordinating Office for Terrorism, Preparedness, and Emergency Response. I keep thinking there must have been an acronym for that, but I'm just not. Pardon?
COPPER.
COPPER. Yeah. In 2009, he served as acting director for the CDC and acting administrator for the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, during which time he is the one who led the CDC's response to the H1N1 influenza outbreak. He has authored or co-authored hundreds of presentations and publications and received many awards, including the Surgeon General's medallion for his leadership during the H1N1 response. In 2009, he joined ABC News as senior health and medical editor, providing medical analysis and commentary for all ABC News broadcasts and platforms, and those include World News with Diane Sawyer, Good Morning America, and Nightline. This makes him not just a New Jerseyan or even just an American, but really doctor to the world. Yes, he does report on teens getting high on household inhalants, what to feed your kids, and how to make your colonoscopy more comfortable. But he also goes to places like Japan, Haiti, India, and Burkina Faso, following up on health crises and on global developments that are interwoven with health implications. I'd like to know which course in medical school could have prepared him for all that. Tonight, we are very grateful here in New Jersey that he's making this house call at Rutgers, and it's a personal honor and a privilege to present Dr. Richard Besser.
Thanks very much, Ruth. It's a real privilege and an honor to be speaking here in New Jersey, my home state. I give a lot of talks, but being on the home court, having home court advantage is always a plus. It's also wonderful to be speaking here with my parents and their friends. Very nice. I've never done that on Nightline or with Diane Sawyer, but it is very special, and it's a real honor actually to be speaking in front of Jeff Lucker, who is in the front row, who was my high school history teacher, and really inspired me with the joy of learning. So, okay. Now I'll regroup for my regular talk. You know, when I was asked to give this talk, a talk about politics and medicine, it's not one of those things that I'm normally asked to give. I give a lot of medical talks. I give a lot of talks on terrorism, emergency preparedness, but the link between politics and public health is not something that I usually talk about. But it's really there. I spent so much of my career as a civil servant in what's considered a non-political venue. When you're in the government and you're working as a civil servant, you're not supposed to be political. That's just the way it works. And as you move up in leadership in the government, in the civil service, you're really restricted from being engaged politically. And now that I work for ABC News, there are all kinds of barriers that are put in place to direct political participation. But that doesn't mean that the world in which I work is not political. And as I reflect back on 2009, when the pandemic hit, it was an extremely political time. And so what I want to do tonight is give you a flavor for what went on then, some behind-the-scenes stories. It was a very interesting period, and I had the opportunity to see things and experience things that I want to share with you tonight. So let me first set the stage as to how I got in the position to be running the CDC when the pandemic hit that April. And so it was January of 2009, and I was Director of Terrorism Preparedness and Emergency Response at the CDC. I had been doing that job for about 5 years. I tend to have this thing about timing. My timing's not always the greatest, or maybe it's pretty good. But I started my job as head of emergency preparedness on August 29th, 2005. And 2 hours after I started that job, Katrina hit the Gulf Coast. And so I was in charge of CDC's response to Katrina. And the following day, the Secretary of Health and the Secretary of Homeland Security arrived, and they wanted to know how I and CDC were going to address that crisis. So steep learning curves come pretty readily to me. So 2009, it's January, and I was with a group from Harvard and a group from across the government, and we'd gone to Israel. And the reason we'd gone to Israel was when you look at a country that's prepared for disasters, there's no country that's more prepared than Israel. There's no country that's more prepared for terrorism, and you know it's pretty clear why. There's no country that's had more of a history of terrorism than Israel. Thousands and thousands of bombs have gone off. The public knows how to respond. And so what we wanted to learn was, how do you get the public ready for a disaster? You know, survey after survey shows that Americans are not ready for disasters. People don't have emergency plans. They don't have emergency kits. A disaster is something that's going to happen somewhere else, even though statistics will show that every single state has had a presidentially declared natural disaster within the past 10 years. It always seems like it's somewhere else. So we're in Israel to try and understand why they were so prepared and how to try and get the American public more prepared. Well, we arrived in Israel, and 2 hours after we arrived, Israel moved into the Gaza and started their ground offensive. And so we had an opportunity to watch the Israelis in action and see how do they function during a true emergency. And it was very eye-opening to see some of the decisions they were making, and to be able to sit in on some of the discussions that were being had on the health sector in terms of who do you evacuate, how do you prepare, how do you get people ready for possibly bombs coming into their communities. So, you know, despite this war going on, the Israelis continued to give us our briefings, and they had a whole series of briefings going on for us in Jerusalem and in Tel Aviv. And so I'm sitting in one of these briefings, and my cell phone goes off. And so I step out, and it's someone from the Obama transition team. And she said, you know, Rich, if you were asked to be the director of the CDC, what would you say? And I said, I'd say yes. And she said, okay, I'll get back to you. So I went back into the meeting and you know, thought that was kind of interesting. And the next day she called back and she said, well, it's down to you and one other person. You know, you can't tell anyone about this. And I said, okay, I have some questions. How long would this be for? She said, well, it's probably about 6 weeks. You know, after about 6 weeks, Tom Daschle will be confirmed as Secretary of Health, and they'll appoint the permanent head of the CDC. But we want you to treat the job, you know, not like acting. We want you to, you know, take the job if you get it and do it for real. And I said, you know, that sounds good. She said, but you can't tell anyone. I said, fine. So I got off the phone and I immediately called my wife and told her what was going on. And she was very supportive. And I called one of my closest colleagues at CDC and said, look, if I'm asked to do this, I want you to be my deputy. Would you be willing? And she said yes. Next day I get a call again from the Obama folks, and they say, yes, it's going to be you. We don't know exactly when it will start, but sometime after the inauguration. But you can't say anything until there's an announcement. So come back to the States, and I'm in clinic. I worked in a clinic one day a week, and it was the Thursday after the inauguration, and I'm seeing this teenager. I'm doing a physical, and my cell phone goes off. And I step out of the room, and it's the personnel office from Health and Human Services in Washington. And they say, is this Dr. Besser? I said, yes. They said, you're now the director of the CDC. And I said, is there someone I can talk to about this? And he said, I'll get back to you. So, the next day I went to Washington to meet with the one semi-political appointee, a guy named Mark Childress. He had been Daschle's chief of staff on the Hill, and he was in place to be chief of staff in Health and Human Services for when Daschle was appointed. And I wanted to meet with him. I'd been doing my reading. Once I'd gotten the call, I'd reread Good to Great, which is one of my favorite leadership books, and then I'd read What to Do in Your First 100 Days in Government. Which was another good book about what to do when you get a new job in leadership and government. And it said the first thing you need to do is sit down with your new boss and get your marching orders. So I met with Mark Childress. He mainly wanted to talk to me about a salmonella outbreak in peanut butter that was going on. But I wanted to find out his take on the CDC. And so I said, when you look at the CDC, do you see an agency in need of minor change, major change, or stabilization, right? So you need to find out, how do they view your organization? Do they think it's in big trouble? And I expected him to say minor change, and he said major change, which is not what I expected. He said, for too long, the CDC has focused on low probability, high consequence events, like disasters, like terrorism. And you haven't paid attention to those health problems that are killing people now. So diabetes, heart disease, cancer, obesity. You're not focusing on these big problems. And what I said to him is, I said, why in public health do we have to choose? Why do you have to choose between those problems that are causing major morbidity and mortality now and being prepared for the next Katrina? And he said, well, that's the way it is in terms of finance. There isn't enough money to do everything, but the balance has been wrong. And so I had my marching orders, and that was the direction. And for the next couple months, I worked on the stimulus package from CDC's perspective, and we worked on getting money in there to promote demonstration projects for preventing obesity and fighting smoking and cancer. Some really great projects that are now, I think, on the cutting room floor. But we focused in that area. So fast forward to April, and it was April 22nd. And my deputy, Ann Shookett, she said, I think you need to come to the flu meeting on Wednesday. She had taken over running our weekly flu meeting. We had a pandemic meeting that had been going on for years. Julie Gerberding, who'd been head of the CDC, was very focused on preparedness and very focused on being ready for the next pandemic, which we all thought was going to be bird flu. Right? There were cases of bird flu going on all over the globe, and this was what the pandemic was going to be. So we had our weekly meeting, and in the meeting they talked about these cases of swine-associated flu. And what they had seen were 2 cases in Southern California, in San Diego, that had involved a strain of flu that was typically seen in pigs. And this was unusual. I mean, it's not totally unusual. There have been 10 cases or so during the previous decade, so you occasionally see one of these cases. So statistically, 1 case is not unusual. Once you get to 2 cases, your probability of that being by chance goes down, okay, fair amount. And then they found 2 more cases in Texas. So you now have 4 cases of swine-associated flu clustered in time. The likelihood that that was a coincidence was not very good. And we were, at the same time, we're hearing about this very dangerous flu that was going on in Mexico. They didn't know what it was, but it was causing pneumonia. Hospitals were full, high mortality rate, people dying. They had no idea what was going on down there. So we understood that a strain from Mexico had been sent to Canada, and one was sent to the U.S., and that we would very soon know whether what was going on in Mexico was related to what we were seeing in the United States. And we sent out word so that states would start looking for cases. Next morning, we got word, yes, the strain from Mexico was the same as what we were seeing in the U.S. And I sent word up to the Department of Health and Human Services. Well, here's where some of the politics comes in. This was a period of major political change. Tom Daschle, as you all know, was not confirmed as Secretary of Health. He went up in flames due to a limousine, which he didn't declare as income. I have a car that takes me home, and I will declare that car took me home. But he didn't do that, and so his nomination went down, and so I was still the acting director of CDC. We still did not have a Secretary of Health, which meant we didn't have a deputy secretary, we didn't have the assistant secretaries, we didn't have the entire political layer in our department. It was the one department that still didn't have a secretary. So there were a number of political types who were in positions, but no one at the top echelon. So I sent an email up to the people who I was reporting to. There was a new chief of staff, Laura Petru, wonderful woman, former Kennedy staffer, and sent them a note and said, we need to have a call this evening, very concerned about these cases of flu that we're seeing and what's going on in Mexico. And so I got an email back saying, we're kind of busy. Could it wait till tomorrow? And I emailed back and said, no, I think that this is very concerning. We're concerned about a possible pandemic, and the White House will need to be notified. We need to talk tonight. So we got this call together, and I'm on the call. And I briefed Laura Petru and the others as to what was going on. And she said, I said, these cases aren't related. This is a new strain. We have all the makings of a pandemic. We don't think that there's population immunity. It's a new strain. It seems to be traveling and spreading person to person very easily. That's what you need to see for a pandemic. She said, on a scale of 1 to 10, how worried are you? I said, 8. And there was this silence, this hush on the phone. She said, 8? I said, yeah. I said, I think this could be the next pandemic. I think the White House needs to know. And so the call got off. We activated our emergency response, and things moved forward very, very quickly from there. But I got off the phone, and Phil Navin, who runs emergency operations at CDC, called me. He said, 8. He said, I would have said a 6. But the point was that I wanted to pick a number that was going to get people's attention and convey that we thought that this was something very real. We've been preparing, as I said, for a pandemic for a long time. There was a national pandemic preparedness plan. There were state plans. There were exercises that were going on. We've been doing full-scale exercises at CDC for about 2 years that really left us very well prepared. But we were exercising for a bird flu strain. And the scenario there was that the bird flu was going to arrive probably on a little island of Indonesia. And we would be able to, as a global community, swoop in with a lot of antivirals and contain it there, either wipe it out totally or delay its entry into the United States for at least several weeks. So we could be prepared, we could set up our border plan, we could screen people coming in. That was the plan. Well, it didn't work out that way. And instead of it starting a little island in Indonesia, it's first identified in the U.S. And so that really turned our planning on its ear. But having a plan definitely helped with that. And when we sat down for our first day of meetings and we laid out what our strategy was going to be, there are things that you typically do with a new outbreak. You set up surveillance so that you can identify cases. You set up a clinical team to help provide guidance to people who are taking care of patients. You look at your emergency response systems to make sure that they're all in place. But one of the things that we did on day one is we decided that communications was going to be a critical cornerstone of our approach to the pandemic. And by that, we were going to make sure that the American public knew what we were doing. As soon as we made a decision, we were going to communicate that. When we didn't know something, we were going to tell people that. And it was going to be a key part of our strategy going forward. We wanted people to get their information from the CDC. We decided that no interview would be turned down. It didn't matter who the reporter was, what the media outlet was. If someone called for an interview, someone from CDC was going to respond and speak to them right away. Because in doing that, you can establish trust. If people feel that they know what's going on, there's going to be trust. If they're silent, you're not going to see that kind of trust. And when we get to the Q&A, I have a few comments about the Japan issue in terms of silence around that. And so we started a series of briefings, and every day I would go forward and do a briefing to the press, some days twice a day, where we would lay out what was going on. It was the same principles. When you have a new outbreak, an outbreak of a new emerging pathogen, a new disease, you have to go at it hard because you may have only one chance to contain it, to get it under control. And so we would take actions that may seem severe, and we would back off when we knew that we were able to back off. We were going to base our actions on the best available science, and we were going to try and gather new information to improve that science. But early on, our decisions would be made in the setting of uncertainty. But we were going to make decisions. We weren't going to wait for more information. People were likely to see conflicting information because things change quickly, and we would try and correct the conflict as soon as we could. And we would take actions that were most likely to benefit people. And by benefiting people, that means save lives or prevent illness. So when I would get questions about why aren't we closing the border? Isn't it of value to close the border with Mexico? Well, we had done a lot of research to show that closing borders does very little to prevent the flow of disease, especially when a lot of people who have flu are asymptomatic in the early days of that. They can spread flu before they have any symptoms whatsoever. So we set up that strategy going forward, and we began our briefings. So the following week, I'm in my kitchen. We just finished dinner. My kids were in the room. I think they were doing homework. And the phone rings, and it's the White House. And they said, are you available to speak with the president? And I said, yeah, sure. And they said, okay, well, please hold. And so I listen, and Rahm Emanuel gets on, and David Axelrod and some others get on. And I hear in the background a television. And it's a basketball game. And they're on the other line. They say, please wait a moment. It was the Bulls and the Celtics, and it was going down to the last few seconds. And so we wait. The game ends, and I hear this groan on the other end of the line, and the Bulls lost. And I'm thinking, oh great. So I'm about to brief the president, and his team just lost the game. So he gets on, and I then had probably the top moment as a parent in kind of public life. So I'm on the phone, and my son just walks out of his bedroom by the kitchen, and I said, "Yes, Mr. President." And his jaw dropped, and I'm nodding, and as I'm talking on the phone, and I proceeded to brief the president on what was going on, and. He said, on the phone that, he appreciated the leadership from CDC and that he wanted to make sure that all of our response was based on the best available science, which for someone who works at CDC in a non-political job, to hear someone at the political layer mentioning science and valuing science, it was an incredible breath of fresh air. So got off that call, and was invited to come a few days later to the White House to brief the president and the cabinet. And I said, sure, I'll do that. By then, we had a new Secretary of Health, and she'd been on the job. Kathleen Sebelius had been on for 3 days. We'd been talking a lot in those 3 days, but we were also talking in the days leading up to her confirmation. And so I head off to Washington with a media affairs person from CDC. And we meet the new secretary in her office, and come in there, and it was great to see her. It was great to finally have a political person who could make some of the policy calls. And I said, okay. She said, okay, Rich, when we go in there, you'll brief the cabinet and the president on what's going on. I said, fine. I said, how do you brief the president and the cabinet? Can anyone tell me? And they all said, no. I said, well, how long should I speak for? And they said, well, probably about 5 to 7 minutes. So I said, okay, I could give this talk in 5 to 7 minutes. I can, as long as I'm given a time limit, I'm pretty good. So we went to the White House and were led up into the West Wing, into the cabinet room. And there's like everybody I've been following in the news. The whole cabinet was there. I thought the cabinet meets every Thursday. They get together, they sit down, they talk about what's being worked on. Well, this was only the second meeting of the cabinet since inauguration, and it was 100 days into the administration, and it was the first meeting of the full cabinet because Kathleen Sebelius had just come on board, and so I'm looking around. It's like, who do I talk to? I didn't know anyone in the room, and there, standing kind of by himself, is Peter Orszag, who is head of the Office of Management and Budget. And he's about my height, which made having a conversation very easy. And it struck me that he had the job that was probably the most stressful in government. Head of O&B is the most powerful person in government. They control everyone's budget. And you can't do anything unless they sign off on it. And so I went up to him and I said, you sure have a stressful job. I said, my job's only stressful when there's a pandemic. I said, your job looks pretty stressful all the time. And he said, well, I've been doing some research, and the average tenure in my job is 18 months. And if you look back to when he stepped down as OMB, it was about 18 months after he started. So the meeting started, and we sat down, and the president thanked everyone for their 100 days of service, told them they needed to spend more time with their families. And then he said, we're going to turn it over to Dr. Besser to do the briefing. And so I gave my briefing, and it ended, and people started to ask questions. And the president asked me 2 questions. I don't even remember what they were. I was just kind of on cloud 9 that I was there in that briefing room. But after his questions, Secretary Clinton, Hillary Clinton, asked questions. And her first question was, what's the difference between pandemic flu and seasonal flu? And for me, it was like a really, really easy question. But what it did was, it was a major icebreaker for me. And what it told me was that political leaders are not experts. Political leaders represent the general public. And those of us who are in technical positions continually make a mistake in treating political leaders like they know something. Because they don't. I mean, the one guy who had me worried was Secretary of Energy, because he is a Nobel Prize-winning scientist. But the rest of them, after her question, it was really easy. It was the same questions I was getting from reporters every day. They were scared, they were worried, they wanted to know the same kind of things. They wanted to know that someone was in charge, that the public health community knew what they were doing, that there was a plan and a way forward. And as long as they heard those things, they were very, very comfortable. And they were very comfortable letting an agency in Atlanta take the lead for this crisis. So, there were a lot of questions, and then things broke up. And as the meeting's breaking up, Kathleen Sebelius says, Rich, I need you down the hall. We're having a conference call with 50 governors, and I need you on to explain what's going on. And John Brennan, who's the National Security Advisor, is sitting right next to me. He said, Rich, I need you in Rahm Emanuel's office right now. I said, we don't like the school closure guidance at all. Schools are closed for 2 weeks. No one talked to Arnie Duncan. He's mad. His job is to keep kids in school, and here you are, you're closing the schools for 2 weeks. I need you in there right now. Vice President Biden said, Rich, I need to talk to you right now. So, and me, I'm acting director. I'm wondering if I'm going to be real director. And here I have these 3 people who are calling me at the same time. So who do you go for? Well, for me, it was an easy call. And I went with Vice President Biden. Not because he outranked the other 2, But it was 2 days before that. Vice President Biden was on, I think, MSNBC. You can ask Rachel Maddow about this. Yeah, the other network. He was on there, and he was asked a question. He said, he was doing a briefing about the economy or something. And they said, is it safe to fly, given the flu, given the pandemic going on? And he said, I don't think I'm going to get on an airplane. I'm telling my family they shouldn't fly either, right? So he, headlines, your vice president says it's not safe to fly. It must be 30 seconds after that, in Atlanta, my phone goes off. And it's some of the handlers who said, Rich, we need you to go on the air right away. And so I go over to the studio at CDC, and it's MSNBC had a program on. So I was on their show, and they said, Dr. Besser's here from the CDC. CDC is saying it's safe to fly. Vice President says, no, it's not safe to fly. Let me play you the clip. And they played the clip of the Vice President. And they said, Dr. Besser, what do you think about that? And I said, well, this is what we call in public health a teachable moment. I said, what the Vice President meant was that people should do things to reduce their risk. And if you have the flu, you shouldn't get on a plane and you shouldn't fly, because you're going to make other people sick. You're going to put them at risk. But if you don't have the flu, it's perfectly safe to fly. That's what the Vice President meant. So at the end of this meeting, when the Vice President says, Rich, I have a question for you, I definitely wanted to make sure that I got to talk to the Vice President. He was actually going to the University of Delaware to give a talk that day, or the following day, and there was going to be a big reception with thousands of students there. And he wanted to know, was it a good idea? Because there were cases of flu on campus. And I said, no, I don't think it is a good idea. We still don't know a lot about this flu. You can go, but you should have a small meeting. You shouldn't do a big public event. And so we didn't. So then I finished that one. I went into Rahm Emanuel's office. I went in there, and just as I'm going in there, I bumped into someone, and I looked, and it was the president. And he turned to me and said something that people say to me now all the time. And he said, you're a lot taller than you look on television. And he turned to Arnie Duncan and said, Arnie, what do you think? You think this guy would be good for our team? Well, when I went to Princeton High School, there was a lot of things I did at Princeton High School, but play sports, and basketball was not one of them. I am like the worst basketball player ever. I said, Mr. President, I can't play basketball. And he said, that's okay, you're tall, you could crowd the lanes, and you'd scare people. So the meeting got going, we sat down, and John Brennan framed it up, and he said, you put out a guidance that says that if there's a case of flu or suspected flu, schools should close for 2 weeks while you evaluate this. And this just won't fly. And Rahm Emanuel's at the end of the table, and he says, look, I'll rewrite it. He said, okay, how about this? And he started writing guidance. And David Axelrod's sitting there, and he says, Rahm, the president in that meeting just talked about how this should be based on the best science available. I don't think you're the one to be writing science. And so Rahm took his guidance, balled it up, and threw it in the corner and used a Rahm expression, which I can't use, and turned it over. And I looked to Secretary Sebelius and said, I'm not very comfortable with Rahm writing guidance. And we left and did our phone call with the governors. And halfway through that call, the deputy communication director came in and handed me a copy of the guidance. And he says, look at these revisions and let me know what you think. And what they did was they said, instead of closing schools for 2 weeks, it said schools will close for 1 week, at which time it would be reevaluated how long they should stay open. And new guidance may be available as more information becomes available. He said, is that supported by the science? And I said, yeah. I said, that's totally supported by the science. He said, okay. And that became the new guidance until we had more information. And so the following day, the Saturday, the president went on his radio address and talked to people about shared responsibility and sacrifice. He was taking our points, and he ran with them and said that there are things people can do to protect their health, and they need to take those steps. And there are things that the government will do. Schools is one of those things. Schools will be closed for a week, and we hope to have more information to support families. And I talked to David Axelrod, and I said, we should have some new information very soon. And the following day, we got more information from Mexico, that instead of it being a pneumonia that was killing 50% of people or hospitalizing 50%, there were cases all over the country. And so what you were seeing in the hospitals was just the tip of the iceberg. And it really wasn't looking to be as lethal a strain of flu as people had thought. And so I said, David, there's good news. We don't have to close the schools for a week. We can wait until there's a confirmed case, and we think it can be closed for much shorter than that. And he said, are you nuts? I said, what do you mean? He said, you can't take the country from here on one day to here on the next day and expect that they're going to believe anything that you say. He said, I want to see more information. I want to see more days of data before we make a change. And I said, okay, that works. And in my briefings, then I was able to foreshadow the change that was upcoming. But what it indicated to me in the whole process around the development of that guidance is that there are certain things that technical people in government do and should do, where the science is firm. How many days do you treat someone with an antibiotic for a certain infection? That's based on hard science. And then there are things that science can inform, but they're really a policy decision. And a decision to close schools is not a science decision. How long do you shed flu virus in your stool? That's a science question, and it's about 10 days. But how long you close schools, well, that involves what happens to those children when the school is closed. Where are they going to get their lunch and their breakfast? They're going to go hungry. What about the parents who have to stay home with them? There's no safety net. Most people don't have sick leave that allows them to stay home and take care of their children. Those things that government should have in place were not in place to support that decision. And so it's a policy decision. And there was an ambassador who came to visit CDC during the crisis. And I met with him, and he said, things really seem to be going very well. What do you see as one of the major success factors in the CDC response? I said, well, I think one of the biggest factors was that we didn't have a Secretary of Health. And he said, I don't think I'd lead with that response. And I said, well, what I meant was that we were very nimble. We were able to make decisions and go with them very, very quickly. And government in general can't do that. And so at times it was very useful. But what was demonstrated by the school guidance was that we weren't able to go through the policy process. So the guidance that we vetted that was fine for Health and Human Services never went to the Department of Education. It didn't go to the Department of Commerce. It didn't go to Social Security. It didn't go to a lot of those parts of government that had a stake in the game. And it wasn't decided by the White House, which is where it should have been decided. And so it was a very important lesson to me about that interplay between technical and policy. So just to fast forward so we can get to some questions. The following month, the administration named a permanent director of CDC, Tom Frieden, who's there and doing a great job. And I, during this period, some of the TV networks had reached out to me to say, if you ever think of leaving CDC, give us a call. So I went through the big job search, trying to decide what I wanted to do for my next career, and tried out ABC. And it's been a great opportunity. So now I spend my time telling stories. I have an audience in a given day of about 12 million people, and the opportunity to practice public health in kind of a sly way, where people don't realize that they're getting public health messages. And for me, I think it's a really underutilized approach to trying to shape health behavior. In the past 3 weeks, I've traveled to Burkina Faso, to Senegal, to Kenya, doing stories that haven't aired yet, but on meningitis vaccine, on pneumonia vaccine, on female genital cutting. I was at Boston Garden yesterday. I was doing a story about 2 little boys with bad epilepsy who've been cured by a special diet. It's a real privilege to be able to try and promote health through telling stories. I think that when we think about politics, you often think about politics as all about political parties and voting and such. But politics plays a big role in just about everything we do, and often in ways that you don't see. And I feel really privileged to have had an opportunity to be in government at that interface of the technical and the political during a very challenging time for our country. Thank you. To come to the mic.
Because we're taping and so
okay. So we're taping, so I would love to have lots of questions. That's my favorite part, but you have to come to the microphone to ask those. So don't be shy. Any question is fair game. Yeah, got to go to the mic though. Unless we pass, I guess we can't pass it around.
They can line up.
Okay. Yeah, if you have questions and you want to line up at the mic, please feel free.
Right.
The opposite. In 2002, I wrote a paper for a program in public health at Hopkins on disasters and emergencies, and this was when the Department of Homeland Security was just being instituted, and all of the different government bodies were being bundled into this one organization in order to make it, in terms for disasters, for another Homeland Security issue, would make it potentially easier for Health and Human Services to coordinate with all the other branches of government, all the different departments, and have a seamless, hopefully, response. At the time when I researched it, it wasn't working out as planned. And the Department of Homeland Security wasn't gelling very nicely because of a lot of politics. And what was supposed to make things more seamless and make communications work better was actually working against, and the different departments weren't coming together. So I'm wondering, as an insider, have you noticed in the intervening years that that's working out better, or has that continued to be, instead of being a plus for disaster preparedness and response, is actually holding things back?
Yeah, I think it's getting better. That department was conceived and born very, very quickly. I heard a story from a White House insider about the discussion with then President Bush about the development of that department, and they had I think a 1-year plan, a 3-year plan, and a 5-year plan for creation of Homeland Security. And their feeling was that, clearly the 1-year plan would be thrown out as totally undoable. 5 years too long, we need to agree on the 3-year plan. And I think they went in and did that, and I think he went with a 6-month plan. So it was brought together very, very quickly, and it takes time to get all the kinks worked out. Not just within that department, but also how that department relates to all the others. And with the pandemic, things worked pretty well. There was a whole infrastructure that had been developed during the Bush administration that had the Department of Homeland Security as the lead, and Vice Admiral Cray, Vice Commandant Cray, Admiral Cray of Coast Guard, was to be heading up the whole response. And she's a fantastic leader. But when push came to shove, they didn't feel comfortable dealing with a health event. And that was pretty foreseeable. But rather than holding their ground and saying we're in charge here, they kind of let things flow in a much more organic way. So I think things are getting better. Come on, some of the students from the back. Any questions? I can't tell you who's going to win Dancing with the Stars.
If the swine flu was a serious pandemic, like it wasn't just low mortality, how prepared were we really for it?
Yeah, we were really, really lucky. Really were, because the virus was not very lethal. People. A question that's often comes up is, did the government overreact to swine flu? And I say absolutely not. You don't know on day one what it's going to look like. And had this been a virus like 1918, we would have been totally underprepared. But thankfully, this virus was not very, very lethal. By not very lethal, that still meant thousands of people died, and those who died were much younger than those who normally die during flu seasons. But one of the things that worries me is that people will take away a lesson from it, that we overreacted to the flu and that you don't need to get your seasonal flu vaccine and you don't need to support preparedness. It's very easy for government to underfund or unfund things like preparedness because you only see it when you need it. You only need, yeah.
Do you think that's happening now?
I think to some extent it is. The conversation I had with the in January of 2009 about priorities. I think that it's an easy thing to let go, and unfortunately, the pie of money for health and prevention is fixed. Shouldn't be. When you look at what's spent on prevention in terms of healthcare dollars, something like 2% of the healthcare budget is spent on prevention. But it's fixed. And given that, the current administration wants to focus a lot more on pressing current health problems, which it's hard to argue with that because they're really important health problems. But it should not be at the loss of being prepared. Yeah. Thanks.
You talked a little bit about your experience in Israel and you've traveled to countries all over the world. And we've just seen a response in Japan that seems different. I was wondering if you have any comments about cultural factors in the ability of a country to respond to a disaster.
That's a great question, and I probably don't have a lot to add on that. I didn't go to Japan. I was covering that from New York. But I was on the air a lot around that, trying to do messaging around radiation. Some of the things that we're hearing from reporters about the response in Japan were pretty phenomenal in terms of the public's willingness to do their part to contribute to the people around them. They were having rolling blackouts because of power shortages, but people were voluntarily turning off their power, and so they could cancel the rolling blackouts. That I think is pretty incredible as an approach, and not something that I think we've seen here in the U.S. In terms of Israel versus other countries, is it something about the culture or just the fact that you prepare for those things that you experience? And Israel has experienced a lot of terrorism, and so people are willing to have gas masks and have chemical antidotes and things in their homes because that's what they're used to. Just as people who've experienced many hurricanes have plywood and are ready to board up their windows.
An epidemic question. With all the digital input that comes into my head, have I read that by the year 2050, 50% of all Americans will either be pre-diabetic or diabetic, the way we're heading?
I can't remember the exact statistics, but the numbers on obesity and obesity as a risk factor for diabetes are pretty astounding.
So that is an epidemic, and it is scary then.
Well, it scares me. Yeah, because if you look at healthcare expenditures and impact on quality of life, it's pretty intense. Yeah, and it's preventable, which is why I think that further investment in prevention programs there could have a major payoff in terms of people's lives and cost to the system.
That's why I asked you that question about prevention, because a long time ago when I was at Rutgers, I was studying pharmacology. I realized that all four of my grandparents had diabetes, and it was an F2 familial, which means I had 4 guns at my head. And I decided back in the 60s I wasn't in the mood to get diabetes.
Yeah.
So at my advanced stage right now, I have no diabetes.
Good.
It's because I live a preventative lifestyle,
Yeah.
so it can be prevented.
That's great.
Thanks to Rutgers.
reports might say versus scientific, evidence that might, when it comes to issues like this.
Yeah, how do you deal with issues of mistrust when the media has one take and government saying something else, and you're hearing from scientists another way? Well, I mean, during the pandemic, the early days, our strategy was to try and make sure people were hearing the same thing from all sides. I talked about our media strategy, but there was also a strategy of going after those people we knew would be talking heads on the various networks. We knew clearly who they were going to be. And so I would call them all daily and let them know what we were doing. I would ask for their input as to what they thought wasn't being done that should be done, with a goal of trying to pull them inside the tent. And then when it comes to media, media often has its own agenda. The week before I briefed the cabinet, I was called up to the White House for a press conference. It was the first White House press conference on the pandemic. And so I'm brought into the Situation Room. And in the Situation Room is Janet Napolitano. It's the first time I met her, and John Brennan, and they're there with their staff, lots of people, and they're briefing books. And I come in, and I have got my media guy from Atlanta. And they said, okay, if there are any questions about national security, John, you'll take that. And if there's any questions about, the National Preparedness Plan, Secretary Napolitano will take that. Anything related to science or the flu, that'll go to Besser at CDC. And so we come out, into the press room, and it's full of reporters. And I would say 90% of the questions, they all pointed to me and called me up. So I'm at the podium, and there was a woman from Fox News there, and she said, Dr. Besser, is there any chance that this could be terrorism? And I said, well, whenever there's a new outbreak, that's one of the things we consider. And so, we look at the strain, we compare it to other strains to see whether it could have been made deliberately. And that's been done, and there's no evidence that this is anything but something natural. But Dr. Besser, is there any chance, that someone in a laboratory somewhere might have done this and then released it? And John Brennan came up to the microphone and said, we've been following the chatter out there, and there's nothing to indicate that this could be a terrorist plot or terrorism of any kind. And she said, but, is there any chance? And while the question was really annoying, it got me on The Daily Show, which was probably my media highlight, because Jon Stewart played this clip, and like the third time she asked the question, Jon Stewart, in the only way he can, said, he said no! And it was perfect. It was just a perfect moment. Yeah.
As college students, we usually only get like 1 year to decide what we want to do for the rest of our life. So as a pre-med student who actually declared public health 2 days ago, is there any advice that, as someone in the field, is there any advice that you could give us that would?
Yeah, ever since I was 4, I wanted to be a TV doc. My advice is, don't be stuck on that what you're going to do for the rest of your life. I've never done the same thing for more than 4 years. And, it's allowed me to be open to trying new things. Some jobs I've taken because I really wanted to work with the person. And when I came back to CDC in 1998, I'm a pediatrician, right? There was an opening in respiratory diseases as the head of adult pneumonia, right? I didn't know very much about adult pneumonia, but it was the opportunity to work with someone that I really respected. So I went back to CDC as the head of adult pneumonia. And it was a great opportunity, and I learned a lot, and it led to other things. I think just being open to experiences and realizing that what you see now, when I finished college, I took a year and just traveled around the world before I went to medical school, because I wasn't ready, I wasn't really sure. And I came back and I was set, I'm going to spend my entire career doing global health. I'm going to be working overseas, and that's going to be what I do. And then I went to medical school, and during medical school I spent 6 months in India doing health up in the Himalayas. And I said, yes, this is what I'm going to be doing. And then after my pediatric training, I went and worked for a year in Bangladesh doing global health. And I said, yeah, this is it. This is what I'm going to do. And I came back to the CDC and learned to be an outbreak investigator. And in my first outbreak in Massachusetts, I met my wife. And I don't think in her scope of things that she planned to do, living in rural Bangladesh was what she was looking for. And so, okay, I'm not going to do that. But being open and flexible is what I would recommend. Getting training in public health is, I think, it opens a lot of doors.
So is there any way that you can actually get I was going to say if there's any specific direction we can take to get involved in something like this, or just be open to anything.
Yeah, we love having interns at ABC News. We have medical residents who work with us every month, helping to develop stories and research stories, looking for experiences and follow your passion. If you follow what really moves you, what you're most excited about, you're going to be happy and you'll make a difference. Yeah.
Hi. I'm wondering if you have come up with any strategies for talking about risk comparison and helping the public better understand how to compare different risks.
That is, it's a great question, and it's probably my biggest challenge at ABC News. I was moderating a panel last year for the World Science Festival in New York, and a guy, George Church, was there from Harvard, who's a big genomics guy. And his recommendation is that high schools should do away with calculus and teach all seniors probability and statistics. And I think he's right, because probably you need to be able to understand risk and probability and statistics throughout your life, and how many people use calculus. It's unbelievable. I'm continually asked to talk about things on the news in terms of relative risk. So saying, if you have this gene, it increases your risk of getting disease X 5-fold, 5 times. And people are like, oh my God, I want that test. So it's like, well, what if I told you that it takes your risk from being 1 in a million to 5 in a million? Say, oh, I don't really care about that. But one makes a headline and the other one is not very interesting. Hi.
All right. So my question is basically, you talked about how other countries are more prepared for catastrophe and stuff like that, but how the American public is not, and how even though we deal with devastating events, we're still not prepared. How do you propose to combat that? Because even now, Americans don't know how to react in an emergency situation.
Yeah. What I try for is, again, what are called teachable moments. So when the disaster struck Japan, we had a period of about a week, extended probably to about 2 weeks because of the size of that disaster, during which the American public was very interested in disasters and disaster preparedness. And every day I did a story on emergency preparedness. Not about Japan, but about how people here can prepare. And so on the set of Good Morning America, I had a Red Cross emergency preparedness kit, showed what was in there. I showed how to seal your house if you've got a chemical spill or a radiation leak and you needed to shelter in place. Talked about how to develop a communication plan. I did a fun drill in New Jersey where I knocked on someone's door and said, you have 5 minutes before you have to evacuate. Here's a list of stuff. Go. And it was a funny piece, but it was a way of, again, demonstrating what it takes to be prepared and to show that a lot of people aren't prepared. One guy was. He was really very prepared.
Do you think that it's been effective, and do you think it should be promoted more?
I think that general promotion of preparedness does nothing. It really doesn't. Very, very little. I think teaching about preparedness in schools and can do a little bit more, but you have to make use of each time there's a little window and you get people's attention, because no one wants to be on the edge of their seat worried all of the time. But during that period that they are, it can actually be empowering and decrease their anxiety. To be able to say, all you have to do is go on that website and within 5 minutes, you can have coming to you an emergency preparedness kit that would give you everything you need to be on your own for 3 days. So it's really easy, and it costs about $50. And for a lot of people, it's like they did that. They took that step during that moment, and you got to make use of those moments.
You spoke a lot about prevention, about things like obesity and diabetes. I was wondering, do you think that should be done through awareness, spreading awareness, having talks, or do you feel that government regulation is the way to go? Because, I mean, I know the right in particular feels that, you want a box of Oreos, the government probably shouldn't tell you you can't have them. So.
Right. I don't think it's either of those. I think when you look at the problem of obesity, you have to look at it at the individual level, the family level, the community level, and societal level. So, I mean, there are certain things that work from a policy standpoint. You can have a school policy that says you can't have sweetened beverages in the vending machines. That can be very, very useful. You could put a tax on a food that you want to decrease the use of. But I think if you don't have a system that supports at all levels, you're going to get nowhere. Certain parts of this country, especially our poorer neighborhoods, you can't buy fresh fruit, vegetables. So telling people that they need to have 5 servings of fruit and vegetables in a day when they can't afford that and it's not available just doesn't make any sense. So policy and programs can have some impact in that area. But banning certain foods, I think that's not a productive way to go at all.
So you've spoken tonight about kind of like a conflict between politics and policy and science that occurs occasionally. As a scientist, can you speak a little bit about like maybe why or how that happens and how maybe us non-scientists can how we can recognize it and know it when we see it?
Yeah, that's a good question. Some of it is that a lot of scientists aren't trained in how to speak English. A lot of doctors haven't gotten good training in how to really talk to their patients. And so you have this conflict where the language is even different. I'm starting to do these short interviews for our digital network. And it's very difficult when I'm interviewing a doctor because they very quickly go to jargon. So teaching scientists how to communicate in English about what they're doing in a non, paternalistic way. When I'm interviewing someone, I'll say, look, pretend that you are talking to my mother, who is smart but is not a scientist. Or pretend you're talking to a smart high school senior, okay, and use the language that they would understand. And a lot of it has to do with that. But there's also, inherent conflicts, because if science doesn't jive with policy, science doesn't win.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, I'm making an assumption that you do support funding for the treatment and prevention of HIV/AIDS and tuberculosis and malaria overseas. So what would you say to a member of Congress who has supported and insists on supporting cuts to that kind of aid and support? What would you say?
Yeah, I mean it's challenging. The whole support for global health. There are different approaches, and I've taken different tacks. Same thing with preparedness funding. Depending on the individual, and you have to know your audience. You can take a kind of geopolitical approach and say that AIDS, TB, malaria are extremely destabilizing. And so a country that is ravaged by those is a very unstable country that would allow, won't have a stable government. It wouldn't be it's a setting where terrorism could breed, and that is a danger to the U.S. Another person you might be able to appeal to, it's the right thing to do. These are diseases that can be controlled with not a lot of money and resources. I think there's a lot of reasons to support global health. Another is that no disease is more than a plane ride away. And it's in our inherent interest to try and control diseases in other places that haven't yet ravaged here. So there's different ways to go at it. But in a tight economy, global health is a very hard thing to maintain support for.
Are you in a position to do any kind of advocacy yourself?
Advocacy, no, but tell stories, yes. This year, ABC News, we got funding from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for our coverage of global health. So we have a one-year global health initiative. And so I went to Pakistan and India and Bangladesh and a few countries in Africa, and I'll be going somewhere else in the fall doing global health stories. And a lot of them haven't gotten on the air yet, but I blog about them, and we have online content. And again, it's a way to try and open people's eyes to problems around the world and some of the solutions that are readily available.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
I know you mentioned earlier that Hillary Clinton asked a really interesting question, and I figure if she did, so did I. What exactly is the difference between pandemic level influenza and seasonal influenza? In general terms,
Yeah.
speak science.
Yeah. So the difference between pandemic flu and seasonal flu, what happens with a pandemic is that you have a new strain of flu, a strain that's mutated so that most of the population has no immunity whatsoever. And so there are a lot of people who are at risk and a lot of young people who are in particular at risk. And so it can really ravage populations. With seasonal flu, the strain that comes next year will be a little bit different from what was around this year, but not so different that a lot of the population won't have some level of protection. So it's that kind of a shift. Each year there's a new flu vaccine because it's a little bit different, but with the pandemic, it's so incredibly different that none of the vaccines or none of the other stuff provides any protection. So you see a big problem.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
As someone who's been who's been a practicing physician and an educator about science and about information and worked with politics, and now a member of the media, I'm interested in the frequent flaring up of anxiety that's come with some of the past outbreaks, and I'm thinking back to the anthrax even before flu, but there have been innumerable times where the member of the media who is closes the story with the phrase, "Ask your doctor for more information," and what that does to the physicians on the front lines who maybe haven't gotten as much information as the president in terms of some of the briefings.
Right. Yeah, I think sharing information with the medical community is key. That was another communication arm that was going at CDC. There's a whole group, and their focus is sending out information through email, through fax to clinicians in their offices. And you can actually sign up for the CDC health alerts, and those come out and share that information. But one of the concerns that I have being a TV doc now is that I'm often pushed to make recommendations that I think go beyond what you can say on TV, where it really has to be individualized to the patient level. And so I'll say, you really need to talk to your doctor about that, trying to reinforce that relationship that is so important.
Well, I mean, I'm saying obviously I have an agenda because I was the hospital epidemiologist when anthrax hit this area, and we were sitting here thinking about how much better the communication was and how much better things worked last year, in 2009, with the pandemic situation, as opposed to anthrax, where my friends in the community who are primary care physicians were going, "Please tell me more because I don't know anything and I haven't heard anything official from anybody."
Yeah, in 2001 with anthrax, CDC was pretty much muzzled. It was not doing a lot of speaking. I was CDC's liaison to the FBI during that down in Boca Raton. That'd be another talk, but that was an incredible cross-cultural experience. But there was not a lot of talking that was being done by science during that.
Thank you. All right. I feel like one of the biggest questions now is about how much funds should be appropriated towards preventive medicine, and I feel like the age-old thing is, ounce of prevention was worth a pound of cure, and that's what's been, hammered home by a lot of public health, officials, and it's been in, our public health initiatives to try and prevent, obviously, like things like, lifestyle diseases. But what do you say about the new literature that's coming out that's saying prevention is really expensive and not really worth it as far as like screening the whole population for different types of cancer? Like, they say that people should get screened at like age 40 or 50 for colorectal cancers and things like that, and now they're saying that it's really not cost effective. And what do you think, like, the political implications of policymakers getting hold of this information?
Yeah, it's really, really confusing, and I get a lot of questions around that because recommendations keep changing. Mammography is one of those. What age should you start? Do you use family history in there? How frequently? It's very, very confusing to people, and I think that there's not enough attention paid to how do you communicate new recommendations. Those mammography recommendations that came out were just kind of dumped out there with no rollout, no explanation, no understanding, no education of people as to why that change was there and what the recommendations really meant. Prevention is a hard thing to support, but you do want to make sure that the things you promote for prevention really work. Prostate cancer screening is one of those areas where there's more and more data that a lot of the screening is not saving lives for prostate cancer. It's causing a lot of side effects from prostate cancer testing and treatment. And so with good communication, I think you can explain why recommendations change, how new information is used to try and improve recommendations, and that's not a bad thing. It's actually a good thing. But when things are just dumped out there, you often lose that, and then you start to lose a lot of the support for prevention altogether.
Do you think that the general public can understand these recommendations, and do you think that they lose a lot of trust?
Yeah, I think you always lose trust when things are communicated well, because when you're hearing one thing one day and one thing the next. This week it had to do with estrogen. Is estrogen good for women? It's good for women in the 50s, but it's not good if you're in your 70s unless you don't have a uterus, in which case it doesn't really matter, in which case people are like, what are you saying? This is just nuts. And it's rarely a week goes by without new changes like that. And every time it happens, you lose trust, and then people don't want to follow the recommendations. Yeah. Last question.
Earlier you talked about how you had a lot of interaction with the Obama administration, and I was just wondering, as a doctor, somebody who worked in the public health sector, and also seeing things from the government standpoint, what's your take on universal health care, and where do you see like national health care reform going further down the road?
Yeah, as a pediatrician, as a parent, I think access to health care should be a right. It should be something that everyone has and doesn't have to do with your income. That being said, there can be a number of paths to getting to that, but yeah, it shouldn't be something that's based on kind of the arbitrariness of what family you're born into. Yeah. Thanks very much.